Have you ever wondered how people managed to sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? Sounds crazy, right? Those stone towers, the wind howling outside, windows without proper glass, and winter hitting hard. In this video, you'll discover not only how they survived, but how they transformed the night into something completely different from what we know today. And the most curious part, some of their solutions were so ingenious that we still use versions of them today. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. When night falls over the stones, imagine the summer scene. The sun is setting behind the hills, painting the sky orange and purple. A stone castle rises on the horizon, its pointed towers cutting through the low winter clouds. The wind begins to blow stronger, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke burning in fireplaces scattered throughout the quarters. Inside the castle, the temperature begins to drop rapidly. The thick stone walls, which during the day absorb whatever heat they can, now return coldness to the environment. It's not just cold, it's that kind of damp cold that penetrates your bones, that makes you want to curl up under anything you can find. And this is where the story gets interesting, because, you see, medieval castles weren't designed with comfort in mind. They were fortresses, thick walls, tall towers, narrow corridors, everything designed for defense, to withstand sieges, to intimidate enemies. Comfort? Well, that was a luxury that came later. Much later, but people lived there. Entire families, nobles, servants, soldiers, cooks, weavers, and all of them needed to sleep. They needed to rest. They needed to survive the nights that in European winter could last 14, 15 hours. Nights when the temperature dropped below zero. Nights when the wind whistled through the cracks in the stones like a ghost wanting to get in. So how did they do it? The answer isn't simple. It's not just they used thick blankets or they lit fireplaces. It's a fascinating combination of architecture, human ingenuity, social hierarchy, and of course, a lot of adaptation. Think about it this way. Today we have central heating, electric blankets, double-pane windows, thermal insulation. We complain if the room temperature isn't exactly 21 degrees. Now imagine not having any of that. Imagine that the maximum technology you have is fire, wool, and stone. And yet, people didn't just survive. They lived, they slept, they woke up, and did it all over again. Let's start with the basics, the castle itself. Medieval architecture had some hidden tricks that most people don't notice. For example, those thick walls, they weren't just for defense. The thicker the wall, the slower the temperature transfer. So yes, they got freezing cold in winter, but once you heated the interior with fireplaces, they also took a long time to cool down completely. Of course, this had a downside too. In summer, they kept the cold, which was great, but in winter, it was a constant battle to keep the heat inside. Another detail, the windows. We imagine those huge stained glass windows, right? But stained glass was extremely rare and expensive. Most windows in the 11th, 12th centuries were just a hole in the wall, literally. Some had wooden shutters you could close, but then everything inside got dark. Others had oiled cloth stretched across, which let in a little light, but blocked the wind. Sort of, so you had to choose light and ventilation, or warmth and darkness. Funny how we still make similar choices today, right? Open the window to air out but get cold, or close everything and stay warm. If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. Now let's talk about fireplaces. The fireplaces, the thermal heart of the castle. But it wasn't like those charming fireplaces we see in movies with everyone sitting around warm and happy. No, The first medieval fireplaces were basically bonfires made in the middle of the main hall. That's right, a hole in the floor, fire lit, and the smoke. Well, the smoke rose and, with luck, exited through a hole in the ceiling. Sometimes everything just got smoky. Eyes burned, people coughed, but it was that or freeze. Only later, around the 12th century, that they started building fireplaces in the walls with real chimneys. This was revolutionary. Suddenly you could have fire without turning the hall into a smoke sauna. The heat was more concentrated. Breathing became easier. But here's a curious detail. Even with fireplaces, heat didn't spread evenly. If you were near the fire, you could even sweat. But if you were on the other side of the hall, you froze. Heat distribution was terrible. And at night, when everyone went to sleep, well, keeping the fireplace burning all night was expensive. Wood was a valuable resource. You didn't burn it carelessly, so in most cases the fire would diminish throughout the night until only embers remained. And then the temperature plummeted. This is where the real survival strategies come in. First, layers, many layers. People didn't sleep naked or in thin nightgowns like we imagine. They slept dressed. Wool tunics, thick socks, sometimes even capes. The poorer you were, the more dressed you slept, because you didn't have quality blankets. The nobles? They had an arsenal. Mattresses stuffed with goose feathers, the best, wool, straw, or even dried moss, linen sheets, which at the time was considered luxurious, and blankets, many blankets, made of thick wool, animal furs, bear, wolf, fox, and even primitive fleece made from lambskin. But the real secret, canopy beds. You know those huge beds with heavy curtains around them? It wasn't just aesthetics, it was medieval thermal technology. The curtains created a kind of room within a room, a bubble of warmth. You closed the curtains and the heat from your own body was trapped inside. It was like having a giant blanket around the entire bed. Ingenious, isn't it? And there's more. Inside this fabric bubble, some noble families placed braziers, small metal containers with embers from the fireplace which radiated gentle heat for hours. Of course, this had its risks, fire, smoke, but when done right, it transformed the bed into a kind of warm nest. Have you ever stopped to think that we kind of lost this wisdom? Today we have electric heating, but how many times have you been cold in bed because you don't want to leave the heater on all night? Now imagine the servants. They didn't have canopy beds. They didn't have bear fur blankets. Many slept on straw mats on the floor, covered with a thin wool blanket when they were lucky. Others literally slept huddled together, sharing body heat, in kitchens near ovens that were still warm, in stables among the animals, taking advantage of the heat that cows and horses naturally generated. Yes, you read that right. Sleeping near animals was a legitimate heating strategy. And this wasn't necessarily seen as humiliating, it was practical. Animals are walking furnaces. A cow generates constant heat. If you had permission to sleep in the stable, especially on snowy nights, you were in one of the warmest areas of the castle. Curious how social hierarchy literally determined who froze and who didn't, right? But there's something most people don't know about medieval sleep, something that has completely changed since then, and it might be the most fascinating part of this whole story. The secret of divided sleep. So, that fascinating thing I mentioned at the end of the previous chapter, it's about how people actually slept. And when I say how, I'm not just talking about position or how many hours. I'm talking about the sleep pattern itself. Because today we have this idea that correct sleep is that continuous block of 7-8 hours. You lie down, lights out, sleep straight through until the alarm goes off. If you wake up in the middle of the night, you think you have insomnia, that something's wrong. But in the Middle Ages, they did it completely differently. People slept in two separate shifts. It wasn't insomnia. It wasn't a sleep problem. It was the normal pattern. And they even had specific names for each phase. The first sleep they called first sleep, or primo somno in Latin. You'd go to bed shortly after nightfall, around 8 p.m., 9 p.m. There was no Netflix to stay up until midnight. You'd sleep deeply for about 3 to 4 hours, and then you'd wake up. And here's the interesting part. This awakening was expected. It was natural. People would wake up around midnight, 1 in the morning, and stay awake for 1 or 2 hours. They did things, talked quietly, prayed, meditated. Some even visited neighbors. Then they'd go back to bed for the second sleep, or secondo somno, and sleep until dawn. Seems strange, right? But think about it. Without electric light, without artificial stimuli, the human body kind of returns to this more natural rhythm. And it has advantages. That period between the two sleeps was considered a sacred time, a moment of deep quietude. The night was at its darkest and most silent point. The whole castle was asleep. You were in a state between sleep and waking, with a relaxed but conscious mind. Many people used this time for spiritual reflection. They prayed quietly, meditated on the day that had passed. Others talked with their partner beside them in whispered tones about things they didn't have time to discuss during the busy day, and some, well, they used this time for more, let's say, intimate activities. There are historical records suggesting that this period between sleeps was considered ideal for marital intimacy. The mind was relaxed, the body rested from the first sleep, and there was still the second sleep ahead. Did we lose something when we abandoned this pattern? Today, if you wake up at 2 in the morning and stay awake for an hour, you panic. Turn on your phone, get anxious, count how many hours of sleep you have left. But imagine if we treated this as natural, as a moment of quietude in the middle of the night. Would we sleep better back to the castle? During this wakeful period between sleeps, many people did practical things too. They'd light a candle, extremely expensive, so only nobles, read a bit, if they could read, which was rare, or simply lay there listening to the sounds of the night. And what sounds were those? The wind, always the wind. It was the constant sound of castles. It passed through the cracks, whistled through the towers, made the windows and shutters rattle slightly. It wasn't scary. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Then there was the crackling of the last embers in the fireplace, that sound of wood softly popping, releasing small sparks that danced in the darkness before going out. Sometimes you'd hear distant footsteps of guards making rounds on the battlements, the soft metallic sound of armor moving, a muffled cough coming from another room, and the silence. That deep silence we no longer know. No cars, no planes, no refrigerator humming, no air conditioning running. Just silence. And the natural sounds that were part of it. Must have been incredible to sleep in that level of quietude, don't you think? Now, not everything was poetic and peaceful, because along with the cold and silence came the discomforts. The beds, even the noble ones, weren't exactly comfortable by today's standards. Straw mattresses got hard over time. They formed lumps. They poked. They needed to be fluffed and changed regularly. And there were the unwanted visitors. Fleas, bedbugs, lice. They were constant companions of almost everyone, regardless of social class. Even kings had fleas. The difference is that kings could change the sheets more frequently, wash the bedding with caustic soda, use aromatic herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, between the blankets to try to repel the critters. But eliminate them completely? Impossible. There was no insecticide, There was no hygiene as we know it today, so people lived with it. They scratched during the night, woke up with bites, and carried on. It was part of life. We complain when a mosquito gets into the room, right? Imagine living with this every night of your life. But here's something comforting. Even with all these challenges, people managed to sleep. And sleep well most of the time. Why? Because they were physically exhausted. Medieval life was hard work from dawn to dusk. Agriculture, construction, warfare, crafts. Everything done with manual labor. There were no machines. No shortcuts. When you lay down at night, your body begged for rest. And there was another factor. The absence of artificial light meant the body produced melatonin naturally, without interference. The circadian rhythm was synchronized with the sun. When it got dark, the body prepared for sleep. Simple as that. Did we overcomplicate sleep? LED lights until dawn, screens glowing in our faces until minutes before bed, caffeine in the system until late. And then we wonder why we can't switch off. Back to the logistics of medieval sleep. Bedrooms in castles were, most of the time, shared. Privacy was an almost non-existent concept. Even noble families shared rooms between parents, children, and sometimes even trusted servants who slept in the same room, usually in a corner, on a smaller bed, or on the floor. This had an obvious positive side. More people in the room, more body heat. A room with 4-5 people was significantly warmer than an individual room, but there was also the negative side: snoring, smell, lack of space, diseases spreading faster. Still, for most people, it was better to sleep cramped and warm than alone and frozen, and the wealthier nobles who could have individual rooms. They faced the opposite challenge: huge rooms, very high ceilings, and the heat from the fireplace that simply rose and got lost up there. So even with the fire burning, the floor stayed freezing, literally. You could have frozen feet while your head was sweating. The solution? Rugs. Many rugs. Not those modern rugs we have today. We're talking about thick, heavy rugs made of wool or even woven rushes. They covered the stone floor, created a thermal barrier, made the surface warmer to the touch, and at night, some nobles even placed animal furs directly on top of the rugs, creating layers of thermal insulation. You could walk barefoot to bed without feeling so much cold on your feet. Interesting detail. These rugs also had an acoustic function. They muffled the sounds of footsteps, made the environment quieter, more conducive to sleep. Everything was thought out. Nothing was by chance. But what about the most extreme nights? Those nights of heavy snow when the wind turned into a storm and the temperature plummeted so much that even the fireplaces seemed insufficient? That's when the most creative survival strategies came in. And some of them will surprise you. Hot stones and forgotten wisdom. So, those extreme nights, let's talk about them. Imagine a January night in northern England, 13th century. It snowed all day. The temperature is below zero. The wind blows with a force that makes the castle towers tremble slightly. You're lying in your bed, wrapped in all the blankets you could find, but you still feel that penetrating cold rising through your feet. What do? Well, if you were rich enough, you had an ingenious solution: heated stones. It works like this. During the day, you'd leave smooth, rounded stones, usually from the river, because they didn't crack with heat, near the fireplace. They'd absorb heat for hours. When it was time to sleep, they'd wrap these stones in thick wool or linen cloths and place them at the foot of the bed, near the feet. The heat radiated slowly, warmed the feet, rose through the legs, created a comfort zone that lasted for hours. Sometimes the stone was still warm in the morning. It was basically a medieval hot water bottle. Only better because it retained heat for much longer. And it wasn't just stones. Some families used heated bricks, others used ceramic or metal containers filled with hot water, well sealed so they wouldn't leak. They'd place them between the sheets half an hour before lying down, and when they finally got into bed, it was warm, inviting. There's something deeply comforting about that, isn't there? The idea of preparing the bed, making it a refuge before even lying down. Now, not everyone had access to these solutions. The servants and castle workers needed to be more creative, and man, they were. A common technique was sleeping with domestic animals. I'm not just talking about stables. I'm talking about bringing chickens, cats, even small dogs inside the house, into the bedroom. The body heat of a medium-sized dog is significant. If you slept with 2, 3 dogs huddled around you, you gained a few precious degrees of temperature. There are records of peasant families who literally built their beds above the space where they kept goats or pigs. The heat rose, warmed the wooden platform, and people slept on top of this living furnace. Seems strange to us today, but it was a matter of survival, and it worked. Another strategy: sleeping in groups. Not by romantic or social choice, but by thermal necessity. Entire families huddled together in one large bed, or several people in a small bed. Parents, children, grandparents. The more bodies together, the more shared heat. This also created an interesting social dynamic. Bedtime was collective. It wasn't everyone to their own room. It was everyone together. Whispered conversations in the dark. Stories told before sleep. Group prayers. Did we lose something in this process of total sleep individualization? Today everyone has their own room, their own bed, their own privacy, and that's great, of course, but didn't we lose a bit of that human connection that came from sharing the most vulnerable space of the day with other people? Back to creative solutions. There's one that's especially fascinating: the use of aromatic herbs and plants, not just to repel insects, but also to create a feeling of comfort and well-being. Lavender was the favorite. They filled small fabric pouches with dried lavender flowers and placed them under the pillow or between the sheets. The gentle scent had a calming effect. We know today that lavender really does help you relax, but they discovered this in practice centuries ago. Chamomile was also common. Rosemary, mint. Each herb had its function, some to calm, others to freshen the environment, useful in summer, others to try to keep fleas away. They didn't understand the chemistry behind it. They didn't know about essential oils or aromatic compounds, but they knew it worked. And that was enough empirical knowledge, wisdom passed down from generation to generation. Funny how today we buy lavender pillow sprays for absurd prices when it's a technique that's almost 1,000 years old, right? And you, what do you think about this? Leave your thoughts in the comments when you have a moment. Now, there's an aspect of medieval sleep we haven't touched on yet: the preparation for sleep itself, because it wasn't just arriving and collapsing into bed. There was a routine. And this routine varied greatly depending on your social position. For a noble, the preparation began hours before. First, dinner, usually a heavy meal with meat if it was a time to eat meat because the religious calendar prohibited it on certain days. Bread, weak beer or diluted wine, cooked vegetables. Eating well at night helped the body generate internal heat during digestion. After dinner, there was a period of socialization. Families gathered in the main hall near the fireplace. They talked, listened to musicians, if they were rich enough to keep musicians at court, played board games, told stories. This period was important. It wasn't just leisure. It was the moment to slow down, to prepare the mind for sleep, to make the transition between the busy day and the quiet night. Sound familiar? It's basically what sleep experts recommend today, having a wind-down routine, a deceleration before sleep. They were already doing this. naturally, without reading scientific studies on sleep hygiene. When it was really time to go to bed, there was another ritual, changing clothes. Yes, people changed clothes to sleep, but it wasn't cute pajamas like we know. It was more like taking off the heavier, dirtier clothes from the day and staying in the underlayers cleaner and softer. Nobles had linen nightgowns, which were considered luxurious because linen was soft and breathable. Some wore sleeping caps. It wasn't fashion, it was function, keeping the head warm. And there's a detail few people know: washing the face and hands before sleep was already a common practice among nobles. It wasn't a full bath, those were rare, maybe once a month or less. But warm water in a basin, a cloth washing the face and hands. This was considered part of the spiritual preparation for sleep, a way to cleanse not just the body but also the soul before resting. Interesting how hygiene and spirituality went hand in hand back then, isn't it? After that came the spiritual part itself. Nighttime prayers. Most people, especially the religious, had a routine of prayers before sleep. It wasn't just tradition, it was psychological comfort. In a time when life was uncertain, when diseases could kill in days, when wars could start at any moment, having a ritual that connected you to something greater was essential to finding peace. They prayed, asking for protection during the night, asking for good dreams, thanking for having survived another day. And then, finally, they lay down. But the preparation didn't end there. Because before closing the canopy curtains, if you had a canopy, before nestling under the furs and blankets, you checked one last thing: the ember. Many families kept a small ember covered with ashes in a metal or ceramic pot near the bed. It wasn't to illuminate, it wasn't to heat the whole room. It was to rekindle the fire quickly if you woke up freezing in the middle of the night. You'd blow on the ashes, the ember would glow again, you'd light a twig, and there you could relight the fireplace or simply have a little bit of immediate light and heat. Simple, practical, efficient. Makes you think, how many of these small, practical wisdoms did we lose in the name of progress? Now let's talk about something rarely mentioned when discussing medieval sleep: dreams. In the Middle Ages, dreams were taken very seriously. It wasn't, oh, I had a weird dream and forgot it. No, dreams were considered messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from demons, sometimes premonitions of the future. Kings made political decisions based on dreams. Soldiers interpreted dreams before battles. Peasants tried to decipher dreams to predict harvests. There were even dream interpretation manuals circulating among the literate. Entire books dedicated to explaining what it meant to dream about water, about fire, about specific animals. This made the act of sleeping almost mystical. You weren't just resting, you were opening a portal to another plane of existence, a plane where important messages could arrive. So the preparation for sleep had this dimension too. You prepared not just physically but spiritually to receive whatever the night brought. Imagine living like that. Imagine treating each night of sleep as a potentially revealing journey. There's something beautiful about that, isn't there? Of course not. Everything was transcendental. Many dreams were just reflections of a difficult day, of a meal that was too heavy, of mundane worries. But the way they approached it, the seriousness they gave to the dream world, created a different relationship with sleep. Sleep wasn't an interruption of life, it was a continuation of it, just in a different dimension. And then around 2, 3 in the morning came that natural awakening from the first sleep. Most people woke up, stayed for a few minutes or even an hour in a contemplative state, listened to the silence, felt the weight of the blankets, maybe adjusted position, pulled another fur over the shoulders. Some quickly lit a candle and said a prayer. Others simply stayed there in the dimness, letting the mind wander. And then, when the body asked, they went back to sleep. The second sleep. Deeper, more restorative. And the next morning, when the rooster crowed, yes, even inside castles you could hear the roosters from nearby villages, people woke up, rested, not perfectly, not without backaches from the hard mattresses, not without flea bite marks, but rested enough to face another day of hard work. And here comes an interesting reflection. Are comfort and quality rest the same thing? Because today we have orthopedic mattresses, memory foam pillows, total temperature control. And yet so many people wake up tired, wake up anxious, don't truly rest. They had fleas, cold straw mattresses, and they slept, really slept. What changed? The human body is the same. But maybe the mind isn't. Maybe we traded physical discomforts for mental ones. And maybe the mental ones are worse. Just something to think about. Well, so far we've talked a lot about nobles and servants. But there's a group we haven't properly explored yet. The soldiers, the guards, the people who needed to stay awake during the night, protecting the castle while everyone slept. How did they deal with the cold of the early mornings on the exposed battlements? And how did they manage to sleep during the day with all the noise of the castle in full operation? This part of the story is as fascinating as it is unexpected. Guards of the night, vigil under the stars. So, the guards, the soldiers, the men, and sometimes women, though this is less documented, who stayed awake while everyone slept. Their life was completely different. Imagine, while the entire castle retreats to warmth, you need to climb a freezing tower, walk along battlements exposed to the cutting wind, and stay there. For hours. Alert, watching the darkness beyond the walls, looking for signs of danger that probably won't appear, but that you can't miss if they do. And the cold? The cold is relentless. On the battlements, there's no wall to block the wind, no fireplace, no canopy with curtains. It's you, the frozen stone beneath your feet, and the open sky above. On the harshest winter nights, the temperature could drop so low that your breath froze in the air, forming little clouds of vapor that disappeared into the darkness. Your fingers went numb inside leather gloves, if you had gloves. Your nose burned with the cold. Your ears felt like they would fall off. And you couldn't just wrap yourself in a blanket and wait for the shift to pass. You needed to move, stay alert, pay attention. So how did they do it? First, constant movement. Guards on wall duty rarely stood still. They walked back and forth in a continuous pattern. It wasn't just to cover more surveillance area. It was to generate body heat. You walk, the muscles work, blood circulates, you warm up from the inside. Stop moving for too long, and the cold gets you. Second, strategic layered clothing. Guards wore more layers than any noble comfortably lying down below. Wool tunic underneath. On top, a thicker tunic, sometimes padded. Then a heavy wool or fur cloak with hood. Leather boots lined with sheepskin inside. Thick gloves, sometimes even scarves wrapped around the neck and lower face, leaving only the eyes exposed. They looked like bears wrapped in fabric, but at least they didn't freeze. Third, companionship. Guards almost never patrolled alone. They went in pairs or small groups. This wasn't just for tactical security, it was for survival. Having someone beside you meant having someone to talk to, quietly, to keep the mind alert. It meant having someone to share the burden of the vigil, and on the coldest nights. It meant having another body generating heat near you. There are accounts of guards taking turns in small stone shelters built along the battlements. They were simple structures with 3 walls and a low roof, open to the inside of the castle. You'd stay there for a few minutes, shield yourself from the direct wind, warm up a bit, and then go back to patrol. Some more advanced castles even had small braziers in these shelters. Nothing elaborate, just a metal container with embers radiating a bit of warmth. You'd extend your hands over it, feel your fingers coming back to life, and move on. Small mercies that made all the difference. Now you must be thinking, okay, but when did these guards sleep? Well, they had shifts. Normally the night was divided into 3 or 4 watch shifts, depending on the size of the garrison. You'd do your 3-4 hour shift and then be replaced. Then you could finally rest. But sleeping during the day in a medieval castle? That had its own challenges. The daytime castle was noisy, very noisy. Blacksmiths hammering metal in the forges, horses neighing in the stables, children running and shouting through the courtyards, cooks yelling orders in the kitchens, weavers working at looms with that rhythmic, repetitive sound, street vendors announcing their goods outside. It was a festival of sounds, and you, exhausted after a night, freezing on the walls, needed to sleep in the middle of all that. Most soldiers slept in barracks, large, shared rooms with simple beds when they had beds, or mats on the floor. No canopy curtains, no sophisticated braziers, just a space to lie down and try to pass out. And even exhausted, many had difficulty. The noise was too much. Daylight came through the windows. You couldn't close them completely because you needed ventilation. So they developed techniques. Some wrapped cloths around their heads, covering their eyes and partially their ears. It created artificial darkness, muffled the sound a bit. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. Others looked for the most remote corners of the barracks, far from windows and doors, where the sound was less intense, and there was an interesting trick. Beer. I'm not talking about getting drunk. I'm talking about drinking a mug of weak beer, which was basically the standard drink in the Middle Ages because pure water was dangerous, before trying to sleep. The light alcohol helped to relax, induced sleep more quickly. Of course, this wasn't seen as drinking to sleep in the problematic sense. It was part of the normal diet. Everyone drank beer all day, including children, even weaker version. But soldiers knew that an extra mug before lying down made passing out easier. Ingenious or worrying? Maybe a bit of both. There's something about this medieval soldier life that's both admirable and sad. Admirable because it required impressive physical and mental resilience. You stayed up nights in the cold, slept with noise, woke up, and did it all over again. Without complaining, well, they probably complained among themselves, but had no choice. Sad because military and social hierarchy meant these men had little control over their own lives. They didn't choose when to sleep, where to sleep, in what conditions to sleep. This was determined by the castle lord, by the captain of the guard, by the needs of the fortification. You were a cog in the machine. Essential, but replaceable. And when these soldiers finally managed to sleep, even with all the noise and discomfort, they slept hard. Because the body doesn't negotiate. When you're exhausted enough, you pass out. Doesn't matter where, doesn't matter the noise. Sleep came like an inevitable wave and took you. Could it be that today, with all our pursuit of sleep optimization, we forgot that sometimes the body simply knows what to do, that maybe we just need to trust it more? But not everything in the guards' lives was suffering. There were moments of genuine camaraderie. On the calmer nights, when there was no threat in sight, the guards talked, exchanged stories, spoke of distant families, of battles they'd seen, of places they wanted to visit someday. These moments created bonds. You trusted your life to the man beside you, and he trusted his to you. This creates an intimacy that goes beyond common friendship. And in the quietest early mornings, when even the wind stopped blowing, there was a strange peace. You looked at the starry sky without light pollution, and saw the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon like a river of light. You saw shooting stars streaking across the sky. You saw the full moon illuminating the landscape with that silvery, ghostly light. Must have been breathtaking, night after night. We today barely see the stars in cities. They lived under a natural planetarium every night. But as the hours passed and the shift approached its end, fatigue hit hard.
Eyelids grew heavy, the body begged for rest, and you needed to resist. A few more minutes, another half hour, until you finally heard the footsteps of the next shift climbing the tower stairs. The relief was immense. You handed over your post, descended the stone stairs, which now, compared to the cold outside, seemed almost cozy. Went straight to the barracks, took off the outer layers, lay down, and passed out. Didn't matter the noise. Didn't matter the light. Your body needed to sleep.
And it slept. And when you woke up, hours later, the cycle started again. You ate something, checked your equipment, talked with companions. And when night fell again, you returned to the wall, day after day, night after night, a hard life, but a life that had its own rhythm, its own strange beauty. And here comes a question you might not have considered. And the women? What was their sleep like in medieval castles? Because so far we've talked mainly about men, right? Well, women's experience was at the same time similar and radically different. And some of the differences will surprise you. Women's sleep. Responsibilities that never rested. Women's experience with sleep in medieval castles was complicated because, you see, men could go to sleep and most of the time actually rest. Of course, they had their responsibilities, their guard shifts, their obligations, but when they lay down, they were expected to rest. Women, not exactly, especially those with young children. Imagine, you're a mother in the 12th century. You spent all day working. If you're noble, you supervise the house, the servants, the accounts, maybe worked on embroidery or tapestries, which was serious work, not a hobby. If you're a peasant or servant, you worked even harder, cooked, cleaned, carried water, tended animals, spun wool, made bread. Night comes, you finally lie down, close your eyes, and then the baby cries and you get up, in the cold, in the dark, pick up the child, nurse, rock, wait for her to go back to sleep, lie down again. 15 minutes later, cries again. There was no bottle, no formula, no baby monitor to check from afar. You were the complete survival system for that child. And children wake up a lot during the night, especially babies, so mother's sleep was fragmented, deeply fragmented. And here's something fascinating. Many women developed an almost supernatural ability to sleep lightly, wake at the slightest sound from the child, react instantly, and then fall back asleep in seconds, taking advantage of every minute of rest between one awakening and another. This ability, transmitted through generations, still exists today. Modern mothers report exactly this. Sleep is never the same after having children. You sleep, but always with part of your consciousness alert. Is this biological programming or cultural learning passed through the centuries? Now, noble women had an advantage, wet nurses. If you were rich enough, you could hire another woman to breastfeed your baby. This meant you could sleep all night, or almost, without being interrupted. The nurse slept in the same room or an adjacent room with the child and dealt with the nighttime awakenings. Seems cruel by today's standards, right? Outsourcing motherhood like that. But at the time, it was seen as practical and even beneficial. The noble mother needed to be rested to fulfill her social functions, and the nurse gained sustenance and protection. Of course, this created strange bonds. Noble children often had more attachment to the nurse than to their own biological mother. They grew up hearing her stories, smelling her scent, being comforted by her in the early mornings. It was a complex relationship, neither good nor bad, simply different. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. But back to women in general, there was another aspect that deeply affected their sleep: the menstrual cycle. In the Middle Ages, menstruation was shrouded in taboo, superstition, and quite a bit of misinformation. Menstruating women were considered impure in many cultures. There were restrictions on where they could go, what they could touch, who they could interact with. And sleeping during menstruation had its enormous practical challenges. There were no pads, no tampons. What existed were reusable linen or wool cloths that women washed and used repeatedly. These cloths were fastened with belts or simply placed between the legs, and you hoped they wouldn't leak during the night. Many women slept on extra cloths on straw that could be easily changed, being careful not to stain the sheets, which were precious and difficult to wash. And there was the physical discomfort: cramps, back pain, malaise. Without modern medicines, without painkillers, some used herbal teas, chamomile, fennel, mugwort, that helped a little. Others simply endured, and yet they still needed to wake up early the next day and work normally. The resilience of medieval women was impressive. There was no time off because you were menstruating. No rest day. You continued. Always. Do we value enough how physically and emotionally demanding women's lives were at that time? Now, not everything was challenge and difficulty. Women, especially those who worked together in kitchens, in weaving rooms, in castle laundries, developed deep bonds of mutual support. And these bonds extended to the nighttime period. When a woman had a newborn baby and was exhausted, the others helped. They took turns rocking the child, brought hot teas, offered practical advice on how to make the baby sleep better. There was a shared wisdom, transmitted orally, about infant sleep. Things like rocking the baby in a specific rhythm, imitating the movement it felt in the womb. Singing soft, repetitive lullabies which calmed both the child and the mother. Warming the cradle with hot stones before placing the baby, so it wouldn't wake with cold when transferred from the mother's warm arms. They were simple techniques, but effective. And we still use versions of them today, because the human baby hasn't changed. What calms a child today is the same as what calmed them 800 years ago: warmth, rhythmic movement, soft voice, constant presence. There's something comforting about that continuity, isn't there? But there was another group of women whose sleep experience was radically different: nuns. In convents and monasteries, sleep was regulated with almost military precision. And for a specific reason: nighttime prayers. Medieval monastic life revolved around cycles of prayer that divided day and night into segments. There were specific prayers for different hours, and some of these prayers happened in the middle of the night. Matins, for example, were usually prayed between midnight and 3 in the morning. This meant that nuns needed to wake up, leave their beds, freezing because convents weren't any warmer than castles, walk to the chapel, even colder, and pray for 1-2 hours. Then they'd return to bed, sleep a bit more, and wake up again for lauds at dawn. It was biphasic sleep, taken to the extreme, institutionalized, made part of the spiritual structure of life. And here's something curious. Many nuns reported in their writings that this awakening in the middle of the night became precious. That solitary hour of prayer in the dark chapel, lit only by flickering candles, was when they felt the deepest connection with the divine. The cold, the discomfort, the sleep interruption, all of this was seen as sacrifice that purified. That brought them closer to God. Do you agree with this view? Or do you think it was just rationalization of a rule that was too harsh? regardless of the answer, the fact is, these women did it, night after night, year after year, some for entire decades, and many lived to advanced ages, maintained relatively good health, produced impressive intellectual and artistic works, illuminated manuscripts, theological texts, sacred music. So perhaps the fragmented sleep pattern, when accepted and integrated into routine instead of fought against, isn't as harmful as we think. Back to secular, non-religious women. There was a time of day that was exclusively feminine in many castles, the hour before sleep in the ladies' chambers. Noble women gathered, helped each other prepare for the night, undid elaborate hairstyles which took hours to do in the morning, brushed long hair with wooden or bone combs, braided each other to prevent tangling during the night. This ritual had something intimate and comforting about it. It wasn't just practical, it was social. It was the moment to talk about things that couldn't be said in front of men, to exchange confidences, to laugh quietly about some situation from the day, and then they put on their nightgowns. Soft linen against the skin. Sleeping caps to keep hair tidy and head warm. They washed their faces with warm water brought by servants. Sometimes they added herbs to the water, roses, lavender, chamomile, that left a gentle scent on the skin. And finally, they lay down. Each in her bed, or sharing with young children, or with a husband. And there, in that moment before sleep truly came, many women did something that's rarely documented, but that we know happened. They thought about the life they had, about the choices that were made for them. Arranged marriages most of the time, about children, about the uncertain future. Some prayed. Others simply let the mind wander, and then sleep came. Gentle, inevitable, and for a few hours at least everyone was equal. Nobles and servants, mothers and daughters, all needed the same: rest, warmth, peace. Sleep was the great equalizer, the only moment when social hierarchy dissolved, even if temporarily. Because in the dark, under the blankets, everyone is just a human being trying to survive the night and wake up to see another day. And this brings us to another fascinating question. What happened when someone couldn't sleep? When insomnia hit, how did they deal with it in an era without sleeping pills, without therapy, without meditation podcasts? The solutions were surprisingly creative, and some of them we could still use today. When sleep wouldn't come. Medieval insomnia. Insomnia isn't a modern invention. It's existed as long as humans have existed. And in the Middle Ages, without Netflix to watch until tired, without social media to scroll until your eyes close from exhaustion, insomnia had a different quality. It was you and your thoughts. That's all. Imagine you're lying in almost complete darkness. Maybe a distant ember in the fireplace casts trembling shadows on the stone walls. You hear other people's breathing in the room, because remember, privacy was rare. You hear the wind outside and your mind simply won't turn off. Worries spin endlessly. The harvest that might fail. The debt to the feudal lord. The disease spreading in the village. The child who has a fever. The war that might come. And you can't sleep. What to do? Well, medievals had their techniques, and some were surprisingly sensible. The first and most common, warm milk. Sounds cliché, right? But there's a reason. Warm milk, usually from goat or cow, drunk directly after milking at night, or heated in a pot over embers, contains tryptophan, which helps in melatonin production. They didn't know the chemistry, but they knew it worked. Many families had the habit of drinking a mug of warm milk before lying down, especially in winter. It warmed from the inside, calmed the stomach, induced gentle drowsiness. Sometimes they added honey, if they had it, which besides sweetening, brought its own calming properties. Second technique, herbal teas. And here the medieval pharmacopoeia was impressive. They didn't have modern chemistry, but they had centuries of empirical observation about which plants helped with what. For insomnia specifically, valerian was the favorite. Dried root, boiled in water, drunk half an hour before sleep. It had a strong smell, kind of unpleasant, but the sedative effect was real. We know today that valerian really does have compounds that promote sleep. They discovered this by testing, observing, passing knowledge forward. Hops, the same plant used in beer, was also used. Dried flowers in infusion, gentle calming effect. Passion flower, passion fruit flower, which grows in some regions of Europe, was known for its relaxing properties. Linden tree flowers, was another popular option. Sweet smell, calming effect. These weren't superstitions, they were real botanical remedies, and they worked, not like modern sleeping pills that knock you out, but as gentle inducers that prepared body and mind for rest. And there's a beautiful detail in this. The very ritual of preparing the tea was already therapeutic. You got up, went to the kitchen, or lit a small candle, heated water, added the herbs, waited for the infusion. This process of a few minutes was meditative, took you out of the cycle of anxious thoughts, gave you something concrete to focus on, and then you drank slowly, felt the hot liquid going down your throat, smelled the herbs, returned to bed calmer. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but the ritual itself had value. We lost a bit of that, didn't we? Today we take a pill, wait for it to take effect, and get frustrated if it doesn't work in 10 minutes. Third technique, gentle physical activity. If you really couldn't sleep, you got up and did something, not something stimulating, something repetitive and calm. Women sometimes spun wool in the dark, letting their hands work in automatic movement they knew by heart. The repetitive rhythm of the spinning wheel turning was almost hypnotic. Men walked through the castle corridors, slowly, without specific purpose, just moving, letting the mind wander while the body tired a bit more. Some went to the chapel and prayed, not long, elaborate prayers, just stayed there, in silent presence. And often sleep came right there, sitting on the freezing wooden benches. And there are interesting accounts of people who went to the stables, sat near the animals, listened to the rhythmic breathing of horses, smelled the scent of hay and leather, and that calmed them. Reconnected with something primitive and simple. Animals sleep. They always sleep. Being near them perhaps reminded that sleep is natural, that it always comes back. Fourth technique, foot bath. This one is especially interesting because we kind of rediscovered it recently. On sleepless nights, especially when the problem was frozen feet, which really does prevent sleep, some people heated water, put it in a basin, and soaked their feet for a few minutes. The heat rose through the legs, blood vessels dilated, circulation improved, and there was an almost immediate relaxation effect. Afterward, they dried their feet well, put on thick wool socks and returned to bed. And often, finally, they managed to sleep. Simple, but effective. Today, we pay dearly for spas and hydrotherapy treatments. They did this at home with a basin and hot water. But these techniques didn't always work. Sometimes insomnia persisted, night after night. And then the situation became serious because chronic sleep deprivation, even in the Middle Ages, was recognized as a serious problem. It made people irritable, weak, more prone to accidents, less able to work. And when home remedies failed, some people resorted to more, let's say, questionable solutions. There were healers, usually older women with knowledge of herbs and traditional practices, who prepared stronger potions. mixtures of various plants, sometimes including poppy, which contains opium, though in very low concentrations in medieval preparations. These potions were effective, very effective, but also dangerous. The line between therapeutic dose and toxic dose was very thin, and healers didn't always get it right. There are records of people who took potions to sleep and never woke up again. Scary, right? So these stronger solutions were reserved for extreme cases when the person was really on the verge of collapse from lack of sleep. And even then, they were used with caution. Most preferred to suffer with insomnia than take the risk. Now, there's a psychological aspect of medieval insomnia that's particularly interesting, the spiritual interpretation. Many people saw insomnia not as body failure, but as a spiritual sign. Maybe God was trying to say something. Maybe it was a call to prayer. Maybe it was a test of faith. This interpretation, while it didn't cure insomnia, changed the relationship with it. Instead of anxiously fighting against lack of sleep, the person accepted it, used the time for spiritual reflection, prayed, meditated, and ironically, this acceptance often led to sleep, because the anxiety of I need to sleep, is one of sleep's greatest enemies. When you stop fighting and simply accept being awake, the body relaxes and sleep can come. Shouldn't we learn from this? Instead of panicking when we wake up at 3 in the morning, simply accept it. Use the time for something calm instead of counting how many hours are left. Just a reflection. Well, so far we've talked about many different groups: nobles, servants, soldiers, women, nuns. But there's a group we haven't explored yet: children. What was children's sleep like in medieval castles? Where did they sleep? How were they prepared for the night? And mainly, what was it like to grow up in such a cold and challenging environment? The answers will reveal a lot about how medieval childhood was simultaneously harsher and, in a way, more protected than we imagine. Little dreamers, childhood, under wool blankets. Children's sleep in medieval castles started very early. And when I say early, I mean early in life itself. Newborn babies were wrapped tightly in linen or wool bands. This practice was called swaddling. The baby was left with arms and legs bound like a small human package. Seems cruel, right? But it had its reasons. First, warmth. The tight bands created an extra layer of thermal insulation. The baby lost less body heat. Second, comfort. The gentle pressure imitated the sensation of the womb, where the baby was used to being squeezed tight. This calmed them. Third, safety. Babies have involuntary reflexes that make them wake up. Startled, that sudden arm movement. Swaddled, these reflexes were contained, and they slept more deeply. Of course, today we know that excessively tight swaddling can be dangerous. But in the medieval version, when done correctly, it was a survival technique that kept babies warm and calm in freezing environments. And where did these babies sleep? Most slept with their mother, in the same bed. Sometimes between mother and father. Sometimes just with mother if father was at war or slept elsewhere. This ensured the baby stayed warm from the adult's body heat, and allowed the mother to breastfeed during the night without needing to get up, though many got up anyway, to not wake the rest of the family. Of course, this had risks. There were documented cases of babies who died accidentally suffocated during the night. It was rare, but it happened, and when it happened, it was a tragedy that marked the family forever. The Catholic Church, in fact, had specific rules about this. It preached that mothers shouldn't sleep with very young babies precisely because of this risk. But the practical reality was there wasn't much choice. In a freezing castle, leaving a baby alone in a wooden cradle was condemning it to a night of cold and crying. So mothers did the best they could, slept with extreme care, positioned the baby safely, and prayed that everything would go well. As children grew, the dynamic changed. Children of 2, 3 years started sleeping in small beds or on mats near their parents. Some still shared the bed with older siblings. Others slept in small groups of children, supervised by a nurse or older servant. And here something interesting begins: the oral transmission of bedtime stories. They weren't stories written in books. Books were extremely rare and expensive. They were told stories, passed from generation to generation, legends of ancient heroes, tales of saints, fables with talking animals. Ghost stories, yes, even before bed, though they were less scary versions. These stories served several purposes. First, education. Through stories, children learned values, social norms, what was expected of them. Second, connection. It was a moment of intimacy between parents and children, or between grandparents and grandchildren, or between nurses and children in their care. Third, sleep induction. The stories were told in a low, rhythmic voice, almost sung. The repetitive rhythm, the familiar voice, the narrative that took the mind away from the day's worries. All of this prepared for sleep, and there's something deeply human about this, isn't there? The tradition of telling bedtime stories crosses cultures and millennia because it works, it always has. Today we put children to watch cartoons on TV or tablet until they're tired. But wouldn't told stories, with human voice, with physical presence, be more effective? If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Now the lullabies, our medieval lullabies, are fascinating. Many survived to this day, passed through the centuries. They had specific characteristics that made them effective. Repetitive melodies. The same musical pattern repeating, creating predictability that calms the mind. Slow rhythm, usually in ternary meter 1 2 3 1 2 3, which imitates the swaying of a cradle or the rhythm of calm breathing. Simple lyrics, easy words, often nonsense or repetitions. It wasn't about meaning, it was about sound, soft voice, sung quietly, almost whispering, close to the child's ear. Some of these songs had curious lyrics. They spoke of angels protecting sleep, of forest animals sleeping in their dens, of the moon watching over all the children in the world. They created a narrative of safety, that the night wasn't dangerous, that there was protection all around. And this was important because children, especially young ones, were afraid of the dark. It's not hard to understand why. In a medieval castle, the darkness of night was absolute. There was no hallway light, no night light. When the candles were extinguished, and they were because wax was expensive, everything went black. And in that darkness, childhood imagination created monsters. Shadows on the walls transformed into threatening figures. The howling wind outside sounded like supernatural creatures. Normal creaks of wood and stone settling became ghost footsteps. So parents developed strategies to deal with these fears. One of the most common, protective objects. Small wooden crosses hung above the child's bed. Little pouches with protective herbs. Garlic, rue, rosemary, hidden under the pillow. Sometimes even small amulets or religious relics, if the family had resources. It didn't matter if they really worked. What mattered was that the child believed they worked, and that belief brought comfort, allowed them to close their eyes and sleep. Another strategy, physical proximity. Scared children could squeeze between parents in bed, or huddle with siblings. Physical contact, the warmth of another body, the breathing of someone familiar nearby. All of this dissolved fear, and parents allowed it. There was none of this child needs to learn to sleep alone. Survival came first. If the child slept better accompanied, then they slept accompanied. Simple as that. Don't we overcomplicate raising children today? with rigid rules about where and how they should sleep, ignoring that each child is different, that each family is different. As children grew, especially noble boys, the transition was abrupt. Around 7-8 years old, noble boys were often sent to other castles as pages, part of the training to become knights, and this meant leaving the relative comfort of home and facing a new environment, often harsher. These boys slept in collective dormitories with other pages, without mother nearby, without lullabies, without familiar comfort. It was a shock. Many cried on the first nights, missed home, were afraid of the dark in a strange place. But they quickly learned not to show weakness, because weakness was punished, ridiculed. So they swallowed their fear, closed their eyes, and eventually the exhaustion from daytime training, which was very intense, took them to sleep. It was part of the process of becoming a man, harsh, necessary in the eyes of the time, but also traumatic for many of these children. Noble girls had a slightly different transition. Some were also sent to other castles to learn etiquette and domestic skills with other noble families. Others stayed home until marriage, which usually happened early, at 12, 13, 14 years old. But their preparation for sleep included specific learning: how to make a bed correctly, how to prepare herbs to help with sleep, how to care for babies during the night, skills that would be essential when they became wives and mothers. It was practical education, transmitted from mother to daughter, from nurse to pupil. And there's something beautiful about this transmission of knowledge, isn't there? Each generation learning from the previous one. Each woman passing forward what she learned about surviving, about caring, about resting, even when everything is difficult. Now, peasant and servant children had an even harsher experience. Many started working very early. At 5, 6 years old, they already helped with simple tasks. At 8, 9, they already had serious responsibilities. And this affected sleep. They slept less than noble children, woke up earlier, had less protection against cold, thinner blankets, simpler beds, sometimes just straw on the floor. But they developed impressive resistance, learned to sleep in any condition. Noise didn't bother them. Cold became tolerable, discomfort became normal. It was forced adaptation. It wasn't ideal, but it was reality. And even in these harsh conditions, these children laughed, played, dreamed. Because a child is a child, regardless of era or circumstances. They invented games during the day, created friendships, and at night, even exhausted, still whispered stories to each other before sleep, still laughed quietly at some silliness, still had hope that tomorrow would be better. Children's resilience is always surprising, isn't it? And here comes a reflection. By protecting our children so much today from any discomfort, from any difficulty, aren't we inadvertently preventing them from developing this resilience? I'm not saying we should make children experience cold or unnecessary discomfort, but perhaps there's a middle ground between medieval suffering and modern overprotection, something to think about. Well, so far we've explored who slept in castles and how they slept, but we haven't talked much about when they slept, because the medieval sleep cycle changed radically depending on the time of year. In summer, with long days and short nights, the dynamic was completely different from winter, and these differences affected not just how much people slept, but also how they lived, and this is where the story gets even more interesting. Summer and winter, 2 lives, 2 sleeps. Medieval sleep wasn't constant throughout the year. It changed radically. In winter, nights were long, very long. In December, January, in much of Europe, the sun set around 4 p.m., 5 p.m., and only rose again around 8 in the morning. That means 14, 15 hours of darkness. And people slept during almost all of that period, not because they necessarily wanted to, but because there wasn't much to do in the dark. Candles were expensive. Oil for lamps was expensive. So you economized. Used artificial light only for essentials, preparing the last meal of the day, doing nighttime prayers, maybe a few hours of work, or socializing near the fireplace. After that, went to bed. Even if it was still 7 p.m., 8 p.m., and then came that first deep sleep of 3-4 hours, then the natural midnight awakening, another hour or two awake, and then the second sleep until late morning. In total, people slept between 10 to 12 hours per night in winter. Not in a continuous block, but adding the 2 sleeps together. Seems like a lot, right? But it makes sense. The human body, without interference from artificial light, tends to sleep more when there's less sunlight. It's evolutionary programming. Conserve energy when the environment doesn't favor activity. And there was another factor: warmth. Being under the blankets, wrapped in furs and wools, was genuinely the most comfortable and warm thing you could do. Getting out of bed meant facing the cutting cold of the room. So you stayed there, sleeping, resting, conserving heat. It was human hibernation. Almost. Now summer? Completely different. In summer, the sun rose at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. and set around 9 p.m., 10 p.m. That means only 6-7 hours of total darkness, and people took advantage of every minute of light. They woke up with sunrise or even before, worked all day, only went to bed when it was really dark. And even then, they slept less. Maybe 6-7 hours total, because there was work to do. Harvests, construction, preparations for the approaching winter, and here's something curious. Summer sleep was lighter, not just because they slept less time, but because the heat made sleep less comfortable. The same thick stone walls that helped retain warmth in winter now retained the day's heat. Rooms became stuffy. Even with windows open, and in summer they stayed open, air barely circulated. So people sweated during the night, woke up multiple times thirsty, kicked off heavy blankets and slept only with light linen sheets. And there were the insects. Summer insects. Mosquitoes came in through open windows, flies too. Moths were attracted to the few candles that were still lit, and all of them disturbed sleep. There was no repellent, no screens on windows, so people improvised. Some burned herbs that repelled insects: rue, citronella, when available, rosemary. The strong smell created a barrier that kept bugs more at bay. Others used fine fabric nets around the bed. They weren't modern mosquito nets, but they served to block at least the larger insects. And some simply accepted bites as part of life. Scratched, complained, and slept anyway. But summer also had its nighttime charms. The nights were shorter, yes, but they were also gentler. You could go out to the castle courtyard before sleep, feel the warm night breeze, see the stars without needing to wrap yourself in 1,000 layers of clothing. There was a lightness in the air that didn't exist in winter, and people took advantage. Stayed up later, talking in the open air, telling stories under the starry sky. Children played until they dropped from exhaustion. Young couples walked through the gardens, if the castle had gardens, enjoying the relative privacy of the warm night. Summer sleep was different, lighter, more fragmented, but also more integrated with social life. Shouldn't we adapt our sleep to the seasons too? Instead of forcing the same rigid pattern all year round? Now the transition between seasons was especially challenging. Imagine you spent months sleeping 10, 12 hours per night. Your body got used to this rhythm, and suddenly spring arrives, days start getting longer. Social pressure to wake up earlier and work more increases, but your body still wants those extra hours of sleep. It was a struggle, especially in the first weeks of spring. People woke up tired, irritable, had difficulty adjusting, but eventually they adjusted because there was no choice. Nature dictated the rhythm, and you followed. And in autumn, the reverse transition happened. Days shortened. The body naturally asked for more sleep, and people allowed it. Gradually went to bed earlier, slept more. It was a cycle, natural, synchronized with the sun and seasons. We completely lost this, didn't we? Today we sleep the same amount or try to, regardless of whether it's June or December. Artificial light tricks our brain. Alarms force awakening even when the body would ask for more rest. Maybe there's wisdom in respecting these natural cycles more. But not everything in seasonal change was about sleep duration. It was also about quality and routine. In winter, nighttime routines were longer and more elaborate. There was time. People prepared carefully for sleep, warmed the bed, prepared teas, told longer stories. In summer, everything was faster, less elaborate. You worked until late, ate something light, threw yourself in bed, and passed out. Less ritual, more functional, and this affected the perception of sleep. In winter, sleeping was almost an event, something important. Prepared. In summer, it was just physical necessity. You collapsed from exhaustion. Both patterns had their place, their value. Now there's an interesting phenomenon that happened on the hottest summer nights, people sleeping outdoors, not inside the castle, outside. On especially stuffy nights, when stone rooms became unbearable furnaces, some people took mats or blankets to the courtyard, or to open towers, or even to the battlements if there was no threat of attack. They slept under the stars, with the night breeze cooling their skin, the smell of grass and earth, the distant sound of crickets and other nocturnal insects. Must have been magical. Of course, this was a privilege of very specific nights, when there was no rain, no threat of war, not too much dew, which soaked everything. But when conditions aligned, it was a unique experience, and children loved it. Sleeping outdoors was an adventure, even if it was just in their own castle courtyard. They looked at the stars until their eyes closed, heard adults talking quietly, felt part of something bigger, of the sky, of the night, of the world beyond the stone walls. How many of these children, after growing up, remembered these nights as the most magical moments of childhood? And here comes a question you might not have considered. What were dreams like back then? Did people dream differently? And mainly, how did medieval culture interpret and use dreams? Because dreams, in the medieval mindset, had a much more important role than we give them today. And some of the practices related to dreams will surprise you. The world of dreams, midnight, portals. Dreams, in the Middle Ages, were treated with a seriousness we can barely comprehend today. They weren't seen as random byproducts of the brain processing information. They weren't just dreams, they were messages, visions, portals to other dimensions of reality, and people paid attention. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, in that period between first and second sleep, with the vivid memory of a dream.
Images still pulsing in your mind, emotions still reverberating in your chest. You didn't simply turn over and go back to sleep. You reflected, tried to understand, looked for meaning. Because in the medieval mindset, dreams could come from three main sources. God sending important messages, guidance, prophetic warnings, demons trying to deceive, scare, divert from the correct path, or simply from the body and mind, processing the day's experiences, fears, hopes.
And the challenge was distinguishing between these three types. There were even manuals for this. The most famous was the Somniale Danielis, the Book of Dreams of Daniel, which circulated in manuscript versions throughout medieval Europe. It was basically a dictionary of dream symbols. Dreamed of clear water? Sign of blessings to come. Dreamed of murky water? Careful, problems ahead. Dreamed of white horses? Victory in conflicts? Dreamed of black horses? Death or disease approaching? Seems like pure superstition, right? But it had an important psychological function. It gave structure to chaos, transformed confusing experiences into something interpretable. And that brought comfort. Some people took dreams so seriously that they made decisions based on them. There are historical accounts of kings who postponed battles because they had disturbing dreams the night before, of merchants who changed trade routes after dreaming of shipwrecks, of peasants who planted different crops because they dreamed of abundant harvests of a specific grain. This seems irrational by modern standards. But think about it this way. In a time when information was scarce, when you didn't have reliable weather forecasts, nor military intelligence reports, nor market studies, dreams were one of the few ways to consult something beyond conscious reason. It was intuition, processed through dream symbolism, and sometimes it worked, simply because it forced the person to stop and reflect before acting. Now, not every dream was taken so seriously. People distinguished between common dreams and significant dreams. Common dreams were those obviously linked to the previous day. Dreamed you were working in the field? Normal, you spent all day in the field. Dreamed you were eating? Normal, you went to bed hungry. These were dismissed. They had no special meaning. But vivid, strange dreams that came without obvious connection to daily life, those were different. Those deserved attention. And there's something interesting, the way people remembered dreams. Because waking up in the middle of the night, in that period between the two sleeps, meant you had time to process and memorize the dreams from the first sleep before going back to sleep. Today we sleep straight through until the alarm. And then, when we wake up, dreams have already dissolved. We remember fragments at most, and throughout the day, even those fragments disappear. But waking naturally in the middle of the night, in a calm and contemplative state, you had time. Could review the dream mentally, fix the details, and many people did exactly that. Some even whispered dreams to their partner beside them, asked for interpretation, discussed the meaning. It was a different intimacy, sharing the dream world with someone. Did we lose something valuable when we abandoned this biphasic sleep pattern? Curious, isn't it? Leave in the comments what you think about this. Now, there were more elaborate practices related to dreams. Some people, especially monks and nuns, kept dream journals, wrote down each significant dream, tried to find patterns over time, looked for recurring messages. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most fascinating figures of the 12th century, had mystical visions and dreams that she meticulously documented. She described celestial landscapes, complex symbols, divine messages she received during sleep or in trance states. Her writings are impressive, detailed, vivid, and profoundly influenced medieval theology and art. Were these just dreams, or was something more happening? Access to layers of consciousness that we today ignore? Hard to say, but the fact is that she and many others took these dream experiences as absolutely real and important. And this brings us to another interesting practice: dream incubation. Yes, people actively tried to induce specific dreams. How? Through rituals before sleep. If you had an important question, should I marry this person? Should I make this journey? How to cure this disease? You did a specific preparation. First, you fasted during the day or ate very lightly. Second, you bathed. Rare, but for this it was worth it. Third, you prayed intensely before sleep, focusing on the question. Fourth, sometimes you slept in special places, near saints' relics, in chapels, in places considered sacred. And then you waited for the answer to come in a dream. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. But the very preparation process was transformative. It forced mental clarity, made you formulate the question precisely, and that in itself already helped find answers. There's something in this approach that maybe we should recover. Not the mystical part necessarily, but the idea of using sleep as a moment of deep processing, of going to bed with an intention, of allowing the unconscious mind to work on problems while we sleep. Modern science, by the way, confirms this works. The brain really does continue processing during sleep. And many people wake up with insights, solutions to problems that seemed impossible the day before. They knew this intuitively, centuries before neuroscience. Now, not all dreams were welcome. Nightmares were common, especially in a time when life was hard, when death was a constant presence, when real fears, hunger, disease, war, haunted daily life. And medieval nightmares had specific characteristics. Many involved demons, creatures of darkness, beings that sat on the dreamer's chest, causing that sensation of paralysis and suffocation that we today call sleep paralysis. At the time, this was interpreted literally. It wasn't neurological dysfunction, it was demonic attack. There was even a specific name for the responsible creature, incubus or succubus, depending on gender. And people had real fear of this, so they developed protections. Crosses above the bed, we mentioned this. Specific prayers before sleep. Salt scattered around the bed because they believed demons didn't cross salt. Holy water sprinkled on the sheets seems like superstition. And it was. But it was also a psychological coping strategy. If you believe you're protected, you sleep more peacefully, even if the protection is only symbolic. And did this reduce the frequency of nightmares? Maybe, because anxiety generates nightmares. And if you're less anxious about the possibility of having nightmares, you have fewer. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, but in a positive sense. Now, there was one type of dream that was particularly valued: prophetic dreams. Dreams that supposedly showed the future. There were famous accounts, queens who dreamed of kings' deaths, and days later, it happened. Saints who dreamed of locations where they would find sacred relics and really found them. Generals who dreamed of battle strategies and won using exactly that plan. How much of this was real? How much was coincidence? How much was selective memory? You remember the dreams that came true and forget the thousands that didn't. Impossible to know, but the fact is these stories circulated, were told and retold, and created a culture where dreams had weight, had importance. And this changed how people slept, because you weren't just resting, you were potentially receiving vital information. You were opening channels of communication with the divine, with the future, with hidden parts of yourself. Sleep was a portal, and dreams were the messages that came through it. Beautiful, right? Even if we don't literally believe this today, there's something poetic about this vision. And maybe there's a deeper truth there, because sleep really is a portal to the unconscious, to emotional processing, to memory consolidation, to physical healing. They understood this mystically. We understand it scientifically, but in the end we're talking about the same thing. Sleep is special, it's essential, it's much more than simple rest. And with this deep understanding of sleep and dreams, medieval people developed a relationship with the night that was complex, rich, full of meaning. But we haven't talked about a crucial aspect yet. What happened when sleep was disturbed not by insomnia or nightmares, but by real dangers? When alarms sounded in the middle of the night, when the castle was attacked and everyone needed to wake up and act immediately? How did people deal with being ripped from deep sleep and thrown into emergency situations? Alarms in the darkness, when night was broken. Being woken in the middle of the night by an emergency alarm was one of the most disorienting experiences of medieval life. Imagine you're in the second sleep, the deeper, restorative one, totally immersed in the dream world, and suddenly a bell ringing, loud, insistent, echoing through the stone walls, or worse, a shout. Fire! Attack! To arms! Your body wakes before your mind. Your heart is already racing. Adrenaline has already been released. But you still don't fully understand what's happening, where you are, why you need to get up. It's that feeling of total disorientation that we sometimes feel when the alarm goes off and we don't remember for a few seconds where we are, but amplified. Because it's not just an alarm clock, it's a real emergency, and you need to act fast. In castles, there were specific alarm systems, bells in towers, horns, coordinated shouts from guards. Each type of emergency had its own signal. A specific bell toll meant fire, another meant enemy attack, another meant someone important was sick or dying, and people learned to recognize these signals in their sleep, literally. The brain, over time, processed the sounds even during sleep and reacted accordingly. If it was the fire bell, you woke up and immediately thought, where are the children? Where's the nearest exit? What can I take? If it was the attack alarm, you thought, where's my weapon? Where's my armor? What's my defense position? All of this in seconds, without conscious thought. It was automatic training, but it didn't always work perfectly. There are accounts of people who, awakened abruptly, became paralyzed, frozen not by cold, but by panic. The mind couldn't process the change from deep sleep to imminent danger. Others reacted wrongly, ran in the wrong direction, forgot what they should do, and in real emergencies where every second counted, this could be fatal. So castles developed protocols. Drills during the day simulating nighttime emergencies, waking people on purpose, doing simulations, ensuring everyone knew exactly what to do, even with mind still half asleep. It was institutionalized survival strategy. Now let's talk about fires, because this was the #1 fear of any medieval castle. Everything was flammable: straw beds, rugs, canopy curtains, wooden beams in ceilings. A simple fallen candle could start a fire that would destroy entire rooms. And at night, when everyone slept, when there was less vigilance, the risk was greater. So there were strict rules. Candles needed to be extinguished before sleep, except 1 or 2 in safe places, usually in a metal lantern away from fabrics. Fireplaces needed protections, metal screens, to prevent embers from jumping into the room. And still, accidents happened. When the fire alarm sounded in the middle of the night, the entire castle went into action. Didn't matter if you were noble or servant, everyone had a function. Some formed human chains, passing buckets of water from the well to the fire location. Others soaked fabrics and covered nearby furniture and structures to prevent the fire from spreading. Still others rescued people, animals, valuable objects. It was chaotic, but organized, because they'd already trained, already knew what to do. And afterward, when the fire was finally controlled, if they managed to control it, came exhaustion. People returned to their beds if the beds hadn't burned. Lay down, still dirty with soot, still smelling of smoke, and tried to sleep again. But sleep didn't come easily. Adrenaline was still high. Fear still pulsed. And many stayed awake until dawn, mentally reviewing what had happened, grateful they had survived. Would you be able to go back to sleep after something like that? Now, enemy attacks were even more traumatic, because you can extinguish fire, but an invading army, that changes everything. When the attack alarm sounded, men grabbed weapons, ran to the battlements, prepared defenses, and the women, children, elderly, They were taken to safer parts of the castle. Inner towers.
Dungeons. Yes, dungeons served as shelter in emergencies. Places where they could lock themselves in and wait. And there, in that dark and freezing space, with the sound of battle echoing outside, shouts, metal clashing on metal, stones being launched by catapults, people tried to calm themselves. Mothers held children, whispered prayers, tried to appear brave even while trembling with fear. And sleep? Impossible. You stayed there, awake, in the dark, waiting.
Not knowing if the castle would hold, not knowing if you'd see dawn. Hours could pass like this. Sometimes the entire night, and when the danger finally passed because they resisted, or because the attack was repelled, or because they negotiated surrender, came a collapse. People simply fell where they were, slept sitting, slept on the floor, slept curled up together. The body, after hours of maximum adrenaline, shut down. It wasn't restorative sleep. It was closer to fainting from exhaustion. But it was what there was. And the next morning, or hours later, they woke up with body aches, tense muscles, confused mind, and needed to deal with the consequences of what had happened. Wounded to care for, damaged to repair, dead to bury. The night had ended, but its effects lasted a long time. These traumatic experiences changed people's relationship with sleep. Those who had already been through a nighttime attack slept lighter afterward, woke at any strange sound, had recurring nightmares, what we today would call post-traumatic stress symptoms. But this concept didn't exist at the time. There was no therapy, there was no treatment. You lived with the trauma, prayed, sought comfort in family, in community, and tried to move forward, because there was no other option. The resilience this required is hard to understand today. Imagine having no formal psychological support, no way to process trauma beyond talking to equally traumatized people, and still continue. Sleep. Wake.
Live. Aren't we today, in a way, more fragile? Not because we're worse, but because we never needed to develop this level of resilience. Now, not all nighttime interruptions were dramatic emergencies. There were subtler interruptions, more common, and these shaped the nighttime experience perhaps more deeply. For example, the nighttime rounds of guards, their footsteps echoing through corridors, the soft metallic sound of armor, sometimes a cough, sometimes low voices exchanging information.
These sounds were part of the castle's nighttime soundscape. They didn't fully wake people, but created a background awareness. We're being protected. Someone is watching while we sleep. This brought comfort. Another common interruption. Church bells marking the hours. The churches and chapels of castles and nearby villages had bells that rang at regular intervals during the night. Matins, lauds, other religious offices. They were gentle tolls, usually. Not to wake everyone, but to mark time. To remind that even in the deepest darkness there was structure, there was order, there was God watching, and many people woke briefly with these bells, said a quick prayer, and went back to sleep. It became part of the natural rhythm of the night. Could it be that having these temporal markers, even subtle ones, helped people sleep better, feel less anxiety about the passage of time during the night? Hard to know, but it's an interesting possibility. And with all these interruptions, emergencies, routines, and rhythms, medieval sleep was something complex. It wasn't simple, lie down and sleep. It was an experience full of layers, of meanings, of cultural practices. But there's still something we haven't fully explored, how all of this changed over the centuries, because the Middle Ages lasted almost 1,000 years, and much changed in that period, Sleep practices from the 10th century were very different from those of the 15th century, and understanding this evolution reveals a lot about how medieval society transformed, and that's where we're going now. Centuries of evolution, from hole in the wall to colored glass. The Middle Ages weren't static. Almost 1,000 years separate the beginning, 5th century, from the end, 15th century. And in those centuries, much changed, especially regarding nighttime comfort. Let's travel through time. 10th century. A primitive castle in what is today France. The structures are crude, stone walls without finishing, holes in walls serving as windows. Fireplaces are bonfires in the center of the hall. Smoke fills the environment. People sleep on straw mats covered with poorly tanned furs that still smell like animal. Sleep is difficult, interrupted, uncomfortable. Now advance to the 12th century, 200 years later. The same castle has been renovated. The walls now have plaster in some rooms. Windows have well-fitted wooden shutters. Some even have stretched oiled cloth, which blocks wind but allows diffused light. Fireplaces were built into walls with functional chimneys. Smoke rises and exits. The air is breathable. Beds have evolved. Now they have elaborate wooden frames. Mattresses are thicker, stuffed with better quality feathers. Wool blankets are woven with more skill, denser, warmer. Sleep improved considerably, and evolution didn't stop. 3rd, 14th century. Stained glass begins to appear in the chapels of wealthier castles, not in bedroom windows yet, but in religious architecture. And this demonstrates technical advancement, the ability to make quality glass, to cut it, to assemble it in complex patterns. Eventually, this technology reached bedrooms. They weren't large, clear panes like today's. They were small pieces of thick, greenish glass, with bubbles and imperfections mounted in lead frames. You couldn't see through clearly, but they blocked the wind. And that alone was revolutionary. Suddenly you could have natural light during the day and protection against elements during the night. You no longer had to choose between one or the other. Rooms became brighter during the day, more protected at night, and consequently warmer. Sleep quality improved even more. There's something fascinating about this progression, isn't there? How small technological advances accumulate and completely transform everyday experience. We today take having glass windows for granted, but for the medieval person who lived through the transition from hole in the wall to real glass, this must have seemed like magic. Another important evolution. Textiles. In the early medieval centuries, wool was the dominant fabric. Warm, yes, but rough, itchy. And when it got wet, sweat, moisture, it became heavy and uncomfortable. Linen existed but was expensive, reserved for nobles and special clothing, but as centuries advanced, weaving improved. More sophisticated techniques were developed or imported from the East. Linen became more accessible. Cotton began to arrive through trade routes, though it was still extremely rare and expensive. And this directly affected sleep. Linen sheets were much more comfortable than wool directly against the skin. Linen nightgowns allowed skin to breathe, reducing nighttime sweating. Small changes, but with great impact on rest quality. And there's another evolution rarely mentioned, the concept of privacy. In the first medieval castles, privacy simply didn't exist. Everyone slept in communal halls, lords, servants, family, all together, or in shared rooms. But around the 14th, 15th century, the idea of private rooms began to emerge, especially for nobles. Separate rooms just for sleeping, no longer multi-use halls. This was huge. Suddenly, you could have a space that was just yours, or your nuclear family's. Could close the door, have private conversations, sleep without being observed by dozens of other people. And this changed not just sleep, but the very social structure. Because privacy allows intimacy, allows secrets, allows individuality. Concepts we take for granted today, but that were gradually built over centuries. Could it be that the emergence of nighttime privacy was one of the crucial steps in forming modern individual identity? Now let's talk about heating. 10th century, bonfire on the floor. 12th century, fireplace in the wall. 14th century, more sophisticated heating systems. Some castles began to have hypocausts, underfloor heating systems, inherited from Romans, but reimagined. It worked like this: an external furnace-heated air which circulated through ducts under the stone floor. The floor became warm, and this heated the environment more evenly than fireplaces. It was expensive, it was complex. Only the richest castles had it, but those that did experienced a revolution in nighttime comfort. Sleeping in a room where even the floor is slightly heated is incomparably better than sleeping with a frozen floor. And with warmer rooms, people needed fewer layers of blankets, could move more freely during sleep, woke up less from cold. Rest quality, again, took a leap. Another innovation: specialized furniture. In the early centuries, furniture was minimal. A bed, if you had one. Maybe a chest to store things. Nothing more. But in the 14th, 15th century, bedroom-specific furniture began to emerge. Bedside tables where you could place a candle, a glass of water, a prayer book. Cabinets built into walls to store clothes. Screens that created divisions within the room itself. The bedroom was becoming a specialized space, thought out, designed for rest. And this reflected a deeper cultural change. Sleep was being valued not just as necessity, but as an experience that deserved care and investment. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me, but not all evolutions were physical or technological. There were cultural changes too. And one of the most interesting, books of hours. These were illustrated, personalized prayer books that noble families commissioned. They contained prayers for different times of day, including specific prayers before sleep and upon waking. And the illuminations, illustrations, in these books were often nighttime scenes. The Nativity, the Annunciation, scenes of saints in nighttime contemplation. Having one of these books beside the bed, leafing through it briefly before sleep, or asking someone to read to you if you couldn't read, became part of the nighttime routine for many nobles. It was meditative. The beautiful images, the familiar words, the ritual repeated night after night. All of this prepared the mind for sleep. And the books themselves were precious objects, made by hand. Each page took hours to create. Having one beside the bed was a status symbol, yes, but it was also a genuine tool for spiritual comfort. Funny how we went back to having something similar, right? Only now it's the phone on the bedside table. Except instead of bringing peace, it brings notifications, emails, anxiety. Maybe we should trade the phone for something more like those books of hours. Something that calms instead of stimulates. Another cultural change: attitudes toward time. In the early medieval centuries, time was measured vaguely. Dawn, midday, nightfall. There were no precise clocks. So sleep wasn't rigidly regulated, but as mechanical clocks began to appear, 13th, 14th century onward, perception of time changed. Suddenly there were precise hours, and with precise hours came expectations about when to sleep and when to wake. This created more structure, but also more pressure. If everyone wakes at the 6 o'clock bell toll and you're still sleeping, you're late. You're failing. sleep began to be governed not just by the body's natural needs, but by social demands. Was this progress? Or did we lose something when we stopped following only natural rhythms? There's no easy answer. Both systems had advantages and disadvantages, but the fact is, over the centuries, medieval sleep became increasingly similar to modern sleep, more regulated, more private, more physically comfortable, and in the 15th century, in the most advanced castles of Europe, a wealthy noble slept in conditions that weren't so different from ours. Private room, glass windows, efficient fireplace, comfortable bed with feather mattress and linen sheets, books beside the bed, clock regulating awakening. Of course, it was still cold compared to today, still had fleas, still didn't have electricity, running water, central heating. But the distance between the 15th century and today is smaller than the distance between the 10th and 15th centuries. Evolution was exponential. And this brings us to the final question, the question that's perhaps the most important of all. What can we learn from all this, from 1,000 years of medieval sleep, from all these strategies, all these struggles, all these adaptations? What can these people, who lived in conditions so different from ours, teach us about rest, about resilience, about living well, even when everything is difficult? The answers might surprise you, and perhaps change the way you see your own night of sleep. Lessons from the darkness. What the medieval night teaches us. So, we've reached the end of this journey. We've travelled through 1,000 years of medieval nights, explored freezing castles, straw beds, heated stones, prophetic dreams, frozen guards, exhausted mothers, children wrapped in wool. And now, before you finally surrender to sleep, it's worth reflecting, what does all this mean for us today? Because the temptation is to look back and think, thank goodness we don't live like that anymore. And of course, there's truth in that. Nobody here wants to sleep with fleas, be cold, wake to fire alarms in the middle of the night. But if we look more carefully, more honestly, we realize that maybe they knew some things we forgot. Let's start with the most obvious, natural rhythm. Medieval people slept when it was dark and woke when it was light. Simple, obvious. Synchronized with the sun, us, we sleep when we decide to sleep. Wake when the alarm goes off. Fight against our own body, against the biology of millions of years, because we have commitments, because we have inflexible schedules, because modern society demands it. And then we wonder why we're always tired. I'm not saying we should abandon everything and go back to living by the sun, but maybe there's room to respect the body's signals more, to sleep when there's real sleepiness, not when the clock says it's time, to wake more gradually when possible instead of being ripped from sleep by aggressive alarms. Small adjustments, but they can make a huge difference. Second lesson, acceptance of imperfect sleep. They slept in terrible conditions, cold, noise, insects, discomfort. And yet they slept because they accepted that sleep doesn't need to be perfect to be functional. We today seek ideal sleep, the perfect room, the exact temperature, the ideal orthopedic mattress. And when we don't achieve this, we get anxious, frustrated, and anxiety and frustration, ironically, prevent sleep even more. Wouldn't it be better to accept that sleep, like everything in life, can be imperfect and still valuable? That you can sleep even if the pillow isn't ideal, even if there's a bit of noise, even if the temperature isn't exactly 21 degrees? They knew this. Out of necessity, yes, but they knew, and they slept better than many of us despite all the disadvantages. Third lesson, the value of ritual. Medieval sleep preparation was elaborate. It wasn't just brushing teeth and lying down, it was a sequence of actions that signaled to body and mind. Now it's time to slow down. Washing face and hands, changing clothes, preparing the bed, drinking tea, telling a story, praying, gradually dimming lights. Each step was a layer of transition between busy day and quiet night. We lost this. We're watching TV, scrolling on phones, answering emails until literally 1 minute before trying to sleep. And then we're surprised when the brain doesn't shut off instantly. Wouldn't it be worth recovering the idea of ritual? Doesn't have to be praying, though it can be, if that makes sense to you. Can be any sequence of calm, repetitive actions that signal the day is over. Night has arrived. It's time to rest. Reading a few pages of a physical book, not a screen. Drinking chamomile tea. Writing briefly in a journal. Stretching gently. Meditating for 5 minutes. What matters isn't exactly what you do. It's having a sequence, a transition, a bridge between waking and sleep. Fourth lesson, and this one is deep. Sleep as shared experience. They slept together, entire families, communities, and there was something in that closeness that created security, connection, sense of belonging. You weren't alone in the darkness. There were other bodies nearby.
Other breathing. You were part of something larger. We today value privacy so much, and rightly so, privacy is important, that maybe we went too far. Each in their own room, each in their own bed, each in their own nighttime solitude. And then we feel isolated, anxious. We wake in the middle of the night and we're completely alone with our thoughts. I'm not suggesting everyone go back to sleeping huddled together. But maybe there's value in rethinking complete solitude.
Couples who sleep in separate rooms for convenience, aren't they losing something? Children who, from young age, are trained to sleep alone in isolated rooms, doesn't this generate unnecessary anxiety in some of them? Each family is different, but it's worth reflecting. Fifth lesson, dreams have value. They paid attention to dreams, reflected on them, looked for meaning. We today wake up, forget the dream in 5 minutes, and move on to coffee. Of course, we don't need to believe every dream is a divine message, but what if we treated dreams with a bit more respect? If we spent a few minutes in the morning recalling what we dreamed, writing it down, looking for patterns? Modern science shows that dreams process emotions, consolidate memories, work on creative problems. Paying attention to them is paying attention to what your unconscious is processing. They knew this intuitively. Maybe we should recover this wisdom. Sixth lesson, adaptation to seasons. They slept more in winter, less in summer, followed the natural rhythm of sunlight. We force the same pattern all year. And maybe that's not ideal. Obviously, most of us can't simply sleep 12 hours in winter. We have work, commitments. But can't we make small adjustments? Go to bed a bit earlier in the dark months, allow the body to rest a bit more when it naturally asks. Respect natural cycles instead of constantly fighting against them. Seventh lesson, less can be more. They had minimal technology, heated stones, wool blankets, fireplaces, canopy curtains, creating micro-environments. Simple solutions, but effective. We today have incredible technology, smart heating, mattresses with 47 different layers, apps that monitor every sleep phase, sleep masks with built-in speakers, and yet we sleep poorly. Could it be the problem isn't lack of technology? Could it be excess of it? Maybe sleep doesn't need maximum optimization. Maybe it needs simplicity, darkness, silence, reasonable temperature, and calm mind, the basic things that always worked. Eighth lesson, community matters. When someone had insomnia, others helped, prepared teas, offered company, shared wisdom. When a mother was exhausted, other women supported, took care of the baby so she could rest. When a guard was fighting sleep in the cold, another was beside him, talking, keeping him awake, sharing the burden. Sleep wasn't a completely individual experience. It was part of communal life. We today outsource everything. Doctor for insomnia, sleeping pills, therapy for nighttime anxiety, and that's valuable, of course. Modern medicine has saved countless lives. But didn't we lose something of the informal support network, of wisdom shared among friends and family, of the simple comfort of knowing you're not alone in difficulties? Ninth lesson: discomfort isn't the enemy. They lived with constant discomfort, cold, hardness, insects, and yet they lived, slept, were happy within the possibilities of the time. We today treat any discomfort as an emergency. Anything that's not perfect needs to be immediately corrected, and this creates fragility. When we inevitably encounter discomfort, because life is like that, we don't know how to deal with it. Maybe there's wisdom in building tolerance to small discomforts, in accepting that not everything needs to be ideal, that you can sleep even if it's not perfect. This isn't resignation, it's resilience. 10th lesson: sleep is sacred. They treated sleep with reverence, as a portal, as a special moment, as something that deserved preparation and respect. We treat it as inconvenience, as wasted time that could be used productively. We pride ourselves on sleeping little. I only slept 5 hours, but I'm functioning. This is madness. Sleep isn't luxury, isn't laziness. It's fundamental biological necessity. It's when the body heals, when the mind processes, when memories consolidate. Maybe we should go back to treating sleep as sacred, not in the religious sense necessarily, but in the sense of this is important, this deserves care, this can't be sacrificed lightly. And finally, the most important lesson of all. Medieval people, with all the difficulties they faced, all the technological limitations, all the challenges, slept. Not perfectly, not ideally, but they slept because in the end, sleep doesn't depend on having everything perfect. It depends on accepting what you have, working with available conditions, trusting the body to do what it evolved to do over millions of years. They had no choice but to trust. We have all the choices in the world. And ironically, that sometimes paralyzes. We have so many options, so much information, so many optimization techniques that we become overwhelmed and we forget the basics. Darken the environment. Silence the stimuli. Warm the body, but not too much. Calm the mind. Lie down. Breathe. Trust. The rest the body knows how to do on its own. It always has. And while you're there, lying down, listening to this story, maybe you're already feeling your eyelids getting heavy. Maybe your body is already starting to relax. Muscles releasing the accumulated tension of the day. This is good. This is natural. You don't need to fight against it. Don't need to stay awake until the absolute end of the video. If sleep comes, let it come, because the goal of this journey was never to keep you awake. It was to gently accompany you to the edge of sleep, and then let you cross over. Think of the people we talked about, of medieval mothers rocking babies in the freezing darkness, of guards walking under countless stars, of children hearing stories before sleep, of nobles lying in canopy beds, closing the curtains, creating their small world of warmth and security. All of them at some point closed their eyes, let go of the day, and surrendered to sleep. And you can do the same. Doesn't matter if your room isn't perfect, if there's a bit of noise outside, if the temperature isn't ideal, if your mind is still a bit agitated. Breathe deep, slowly. Feel the weight of your body on the bed. Feel the comfort of the blankets. Feel the darkness around you, not as threat, but as embrace. The night protects you. It always has. Since the first humans sleeping in caves, protecting themselves from darkness with fire. Through medieval castles with their fireplaces and wool blankets. Until today, with you there, in this moment, in this place. Different eras, different technologies, but the same fundamental human need: to rest, to dream, to renew.
And you deserve this. Deserve a peaceful night. deserve to wake up rested tomorrow, deserve peace. So let the body do what it knows how to do. Let the mind calm down. Let thoughts become slower, more distant, like ships moving away on the horizon of a calm sea at sunset. If there are still worries, they can wait. Tomorrow, you'll deal with them. Now is time to rest. If there are still unanswered questions, that's okay. Not everything needs to be resolved before sleep.
Some things resolve themselves while you sleep. Remember, as the medievals knew, as modern science confirms, sleep works for you, not against you. So imagine you're in one of those castles we explored. Choose the scene that appeals to you most. Maybe you're in a noble room with a canopy bed, heavy curtains creating a bubble of warmth around you, soft linen sheets against your skin, a little pouch of lavender under the pillow releasing gentle aroma, the distant sound of wind outside, but you're protected, warmed, safe. Or maybe you prefer to imagine one of the summer nights, lying in an open courtyard, looking at the stars, the Milky Way stretching like a river of light above, the warm breeze caressing your face, the smell of earth and grass, the sound of distant crickets creating a natural symphony. Or maybe you're among those who found peace in the period between the two sleeps, awake in the quietude of the deepest early morning, neither completely awake nor completely asleep, in an intermediate state where the mind floats freely without clinging to anything. Whatever image calms you, stay with it. Let it fill your consciousness. Let the sensory details become real. The sound of wind, the smell of lavender, the texture of wool, the weight of blankets, the warmth spreading from the center of the body to the limbs. And as you breathe, slowly and deeply, you realize you're doing exactly what millions of people did before you. Over centuries, over millennia. Lying down when the day ends. Trusting the night. Allowing sleep to come. There's nothing new in this. There's nothing special, and that's exactly where the beauty lies. In the simplicity, in the continuity, in the fact that this is a universal human experience that crosses time and space. You're connected with all who came before, and with all who will come after. All of us eventually close our eyes. Let go of control and trust, and it's okay. More than okay. It's right. It's natural, so go ahead, let it happen. Let thoughts become slower, more spaced, like waves on an increasingly calm ocean. Let breathing deepen, become rhythmic, automatic. Let the body become heavy, sinking gently into the bed, as if gravity doubled in strength but in a comfortable way, pulling you down to rest. And if there's still a part of you that's listening to this that's conscious, that's okay too. Don't force anything. Sleep comes when it comes, in its own time, not yours. Your job is just to create the conditions. And you've already done that. You're lying down, you're comfortable, you're safe. The rest happens on its own. Think that you're like that medieval noble, closing the canopy curtains around the bed, creating your own small private world, your refuge against the cold outside. Only your canopy isn't made of heavy fabric. It's made of gentle darkness, of silence, of peaceful breathing, and inside it, you're protected. Nothing can reach you here. Not worries, not anxiety, not time passing. Here is timeless, it's suspended. It's just you and the present moment. And the present moment is calm, is gentle, is exactly what it needs to be. What a journey, right? If you enjoyed traveling with us through these medieval nights, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflection, if something in this story touched you in some way, share in the comments. We love to know what resonates with you, and now it's just letting go, letting the day go away, letting worries go away, letting even this story go away, because it fulfilled its purpose. It brought you here. to this moment of quietude, and from here forward, it's just you and sleep. And the night that waits for you with infinite patience. It always waited, it always will wait, so when you're ready, simply let it happen. Good night, sleep well, and until the next journey.